issue is if Congress lacks the power to do something today, but then the president enters into a treaty promising that we will do that thing tomorrow, does Congress automatically then get the power to do that thing? Or to maybe put a finer point on it, can the treaty increase the power of Congress, enhance the power of Congress? That's the issue. That's what's at issue here. So Mrs. Bond says, Mrs. Bond is being tried under the Chemical Weapons Convention Implementation Act. Mrs. Bond says, where does Congress get power to enact this thing? Which of the enumerated powers justifies this statute? And the government says, even if, as a general matter, we wouldn't have power to enact this thing, even if this is presumptively beyond Congress, even if we assume this is beyond Congress's power to enact, in general, it's fine now, and the reason is there's this treaty. So we entered into this treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and thus Congress has power to pass this, to enact this Chemical Weapons Convention Implementation Act, even if it would have lacked the power before. So that's what's at issue in the case. Missouri v. Holland in 1920, Justice Holmes seemed to say that, in fact, the answer is yes. If a treaty promises that Congress will do something, Congress automatically gets the power to do that thing, Justice Holmes seemed to say. Now, he seemed to say it in a single sentence in 1920 with no citation, no reasoning whatsoever, just a sentence. But it seems to say that if the president makes such a promise, then Congress automatically gets that power. And I think that's wrong. So I wrote an article in 2005 saying that was right, and Mrs. Bond is now arguing that that's wrong, and we are supporting that claim. And I'm just going to make the point here. I'm just going to make for you the textual point and then the structural point. And that should really, I think, suffice for this. Textual point's pretty straightforward. The relevant clauses of the Constitution here are the necessary and proper clause and the treaty clause. And I'll just, now again, Justice Holmes could not be bothered actually even to quote these clauses or gesture toward them, but I'm going to give you just the language so you can hear what is at issue. The necessary and proper clause, Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Now, so again, carrying into execution the foregoing powers, those are the ones that are listed earlier in Article 1, Section 8, nothing about treaties or earlier in Article 1, Section 8, so that's not relevant. And all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, that is relevant. So the treaty power is another power vested in the Constitution. So it does connect up with or refer to the treaty power. And I'll just give you that. That's in Article 2. The president shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. And so we could connect those two clauses grammatically, try to see how they fit together. Here's how they fit together as a matter of grammar. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution, ... the president's power to make treaties. And I think when we do this, it becomes clear that the important words, the crucial words, are the words to make treaties. This is necessary and proper for carrying into execution the president's power to make treaties. This would clearly include, for example, an appropriation of money, sending an ambassador to negotiate a treaty. That would be necessary and proper to the making of a treaty. But that's not what is at issue here. So what's at issue here is Congress's power to implement a treaty that has already been made. Right? This treaty has already made. There's no sense in which this statute, the Chemical Weapons Convention Implementation Act, helps you to make that treaty. Treaty's already made. So this is just a misreading of the way these clauses fit together. This is Congress has the power to make laws to help make treaties, but there's no freestanding power to help execute treaties. So this is a pretty straightforward textual point. The Supreme Court saw this point clearly in a bit when it was looking at a bit of parallel statutory language. So in Patterson v. McLean Credit Union, the court was looking at a statute that concerned the right to make contracts. Now you can tell that's similar, right? It's got the same key infinitive verb to make. And moreover, a non-self-executing treaty is actually in the nature of a contract. They're kind of similar. It's like a contract between nations. So trying to figure out what the right to make contracts entails, here's the Supreme Court, quote, "The right to make contracts does not extend, as a matter of either logic or semantics, to conduct after the contract relation has been established, including breach of the terms of the contract. Such post-formation conduct does not involve the right to make a contract, but rather implicates the performance of established contract obligations." And the point's exactly the same here. The power to make treaties does not extend as a matter of logic or semantics to the implementation of treaties already made. So that's the clear textual point. That the only clauses anybody's ever pointed to for this purported Missouri v. Holland power are these two clauses, and they just don't do the work. They just do not do the work of giving Congress the power to implement treaties already made. That's the textual point. Now, I'm just going to make the basic structural point as well. Here at the Cato Institute, I'm going to go ahead and guess that many of you have intuited the structural point already. But this Missouri v. Holland idea is kind of obviously in deep, deep tension with the premise of enumerated powers and with the 10th Amendment premise that some powers are reserved, right? The federal government does not have power over everything. So, if this were right, if Missouri v. Holland is right, then this is like a wish for more wishes power. The president just needs to find a foreign sovereign, it can be any foreign sovereign, so Zimbabwe or whatever, and can agree, as to something like regulating guns near schools. Now, the court has said Congress lacks the power to do that in a case called U.S. v. Lopez. But, if the president in Zimbabwe agree that it's important to regulate guns near schools, suddenly Congress would get that power under Missouri v. Holland. And that's the tip of the iceberg. You can imagine, an agreement simply to regulate the citizenry to maximize collective welfare or something, and then Congress would have plenary legislative power, theoretically, under Missouri v. Holland. It just seems like that can't be right. It's in tension with all kinds of canonical statements that the powers of Congress are limited and defined and enumerated and so forth. So it seems like this is in deep tension with some basic structural ideas. Another way to put the point is Congress's power is limited to those things herein granted. It's an enumeration. Congress's power is limited to those things herein granted in the Constitution. As a general matter, that list can only be increased by constitutional amendment. And that's happened a number of times. So there are a number of constitutional amendments that say Congress shall have power to enforce this amendment. So it's happened a number of times. That's the way Congress gets new powers via constitutional amendment. And of course, Article 5, the mechanism for amending the Constitution, very elaborate, hard to do, but it has been done a number of times. The mechanism for making a treaty is much easier. So on Missouri v. Holland, if that were right, you have the Article 5 mechanism for increasing Congress's power. And then you have this other mechanism, this much easier mechanism if you can just find a friendly, nation who wants to agree with you. So, another way to put this point is it's just a subversion of Article 5. It's just a way of enhancing Congress's power without bothering to amend the Constitution. It's kind of a circumvention of Article 5. Now, so if it's weird to think that a treaty can increase the power of Congress, surely it's doubly strange to think that the president can decrease the power of Congress and decrease it unilaterally and thus render statutes unconstitutional. But consider that also follows from Missouri v. Holland. The conventional wisdom is that the president can abrogate a treaty unilaterally for any reason at all. The president decides it's no longer a good treaty. But under Missouri v. Holland, in theory, right, you enter into the treaty, Congress gets the new power and passes a statute pursuant to it, and then at some point the president decides he doesn't like the treaty anymore, abrogates the treaty, and now what? Has the statute now been rendered unconstitutional? Isn't that odd? As a general matter, the president gets to, sign or veto bills, but that's the end of his legislative involvement. Once it becomes a law, it's a law. But not this category. For this category of statute, the president gets to render the statute unconstitutional anytime he wants, for any reason or no reason, just by abrogating the treaty. Isn't that strange to think? And if that's strange, consider the president's not the only person who gets to do that. So foreign sovereigns also can abrogate treaties. So wouldn't the framers have found it surprising to imagine that a federal statute duly passed by both the House of Representatives and the Senate, signed by the president, law of the land here in the United States, might be rendered unconstitutional at some later date at the sole discretion of, for example, the King of England? And yet that too follows from Missouri v. Holland, right? When the other sovereign decides he doesn't like the treaty anymore, suddenly our statute's rendered unconstitutional. It just cannot be right. After all, ending foreign control over domestic legislation was actually the first idea in the Declaration of Independence. It's hard to imagine that they thought the King of England was going to have that power. And then I'll make the structural point one last way. Another way to think about this is the Missouri v. Holland idea creates this doubly perverse incentive. There are two things that the framers were deeply concerned about. One is the tendency of legislative power to increase, the danger that the legislature can pull everything into its impetuous vortex. They were very worried about that. We all know that was a big concern of the framers. Second big concern of the framers was international entanglements. They were very nervous about international entanglements. They made treaties hard to enter into. They were worried about it. So if you think about the framers having these two deep concerns, isn't it strange to think they created a system with this doubly perverse incentive where the president's going to want to enter into new international entanglements exactly so that there can be more domestic legislative power in Congress? This kind of perverse incentive to do these two things that the framers did not want done, right? More international entanglements precisely to get more domestic legislative power. I think the Constitution should not be interpreted to have this kind of doubly perverse incentive. So that's just another way to see the structural point. I'd say the text and the structure here cohere to tell us that a treaty really cannot increase the legislative power of Congress. Congress's powers are fixed and defined, and a treaty cannot do anything to change that. That's my claim, and that's our claim in our green brief here in Bonds. So.